All right, before we begin, while I was editing this, I totally forgot that we didn't mention how this board or this graph works. So at the top we have my argument. At the bottom left we have Ryan's argument, and at the bottom right we have Raymond's argument. They're all color coded, and then the closer you get in, so the center of the board where government is, that's all things that we kind of agree for almost most of it. So that's the parts we really, really agree on. Now, parts that are further away from the center and closer to our individual arguments, those are points that are much more specific to our argument.
So my name is Ryan, and my argument is that while undocumented Americans are mistreated in many ways, all of them point back to the government.
My name's Garrett. My argument is America has caused undocumented Americans to live in poor and unhealthy conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, and my name is Raymond, and my argument is that the immigration policies are flawed and are in need of reformation.
So one thing all of our arguments points to is that government plays a part in all of them. There's slight difference in how much of an extent to that is. However, that's kind of where it starts out. If you want to explain the next part.
Yeah, so we all agree with government. And then at the beginning of the book, Villavicencio says, names of all persons have been changed, names of all places have been changed, and physical descriptions have all been changed, or have they? And we all agree that this could mean two things. The first thing that we all pretty much agree on is that this shows that these undocumented Americans are potentially in danger by her posting this book. It can also mean that the stories are made up or fictional. However, most of us agree with that first one, and even if it were the second one, where all these stories are made up and fictional, the fact that so many people have read this book and so many people have loved this book shows that these stories may be fictional, but they're totally realistic to us. They're something that could totally happen. And the fact that these stories may be fictional, but totally seem realistic to us, shows us how much of a problem.
So one of the primary evidences for my argument was the part of the book around page 61 where it mentions that the House of Representatives voted on a new piece of legislation that lists cesarean sections, rape, and depression as pre-existing conditions. And that would mean 23 million Americans would lose access to health care. However, where that ties in with my argument was that because undocumented Americans normally cannot buy health care due to lack of state identification, et cetera, that it causes a specific problem there caused by the government that limits access to health care for all these conditions that undocumented Americans might have.
Yeah. So one of the arguments that I have that, or one of the pieces of evidence I have that solely relates to my argument is in chapter 1 when they talk about 9/11 and the first responders, second responders of 9/11. So the first in the book, she quotes the first responders were the firefighters, the policemen. The secondary responders were undocumented Americans, and many of these undocumented Americans were kind of screwed over by the government because when they went to look for treatment and healthcare, they were either denied it or they were given it, but with very, very poor quality and not as good as they deserved.
Yeah, so, and for the arguments that I have for mine, they're not solely just for mine. They tie in with the other arguments that are on this. So one of them are gonna be the hate crimes. It mentions like numerous examples of like people who've been like unjustly like abused or mistreated just because of their race, and it ties in with a lot of other ideas and values that the other arguments present. And my other argument is the taxes. So basically, on page 137, it states that they don't have a social security number, but they're allowed to pay taxes through the ITIN number. But the fact that they're still considered illegal because they're undocumented Americans makes it kind of confusing, because they're still considered illegal, so they can't do the things that normal Americans can do. So they still pay taxes, but they don't get the same benefits.
So mine and Raymond's arguments had a lot in common. So we had a few evidence that supported both of our arguments. One of these is all the prejudice. So a common idea between our arguments is that prejudice is a cause of these undocumented Americans suffering or poor conditions. Another one was in Flint. So in Flint, they had pretty much really poor working conditions and poor living conditions because the town was pretty unsafe because of water problems. And that ties into my argument, because they live in poor conditions, which is both caused by government but also caused by pretty much managers at companies who are looking to hire certain people to do these jobs. And it ties into Raymond's because in Flint, it's again that idea of prejudice, which ties in to mine and Raymond's a lot.
So one similarity between Raymond and I's arguments was in regards to the effective policy. We kind of disagree on like which policy. However, generally, with mine, like the act being voted on here, there's another quote too about in Flint with them stating that the water had been like within federal regulations for 2 years, and so they're cutting off the government giving out water, and just other things like that, all tie back to policy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next, I think we'll specifically say which logos, or whether we have logos, pathos, or ethos, which mainly supports your claim, and just explain a little bit why ethos, pathos, or logos. Sound good? Okay. So my argument is mostly supported by pathos, and we can see that in the stories of both Flint and the first or second responders of 9/11. Both of these stories rely a lot on pathos and emotion to get their point across that these undocumented Americans are doing amazing things, but they are not being rewarded for it, and in fact, they're actually suffering from this. You guys can do whichever.
So, for mine, my argument, I could say, uses a little bit of both pathos and logos, because the fact of the government and the policies, they give numerous examples of like logical reasonings as to why there's the argument is present. And also with pathos, we the examples pull emotions from when we talk about the hate crimes. It gives the reader that sense of like sympathy and feeling for the unjust acts.
My argument is pretty purely logos, as it is. All the quotes I have are just in regards to how a policy caused something. Say with when they're talking about some of the people who worked the cleanup for like 9/11, and they mentioned that some of the ICE officers will decide to let you stay because you have your like hospital ID and some of your medication. However, they still technically by law would deport you because you're undocumented. They can still decide to help you. That is due to a government policy. Another one where it talks about the kids at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport seeing their father being like deported. That happened because of government policy. Flint, a lot of government policy being tied in there.
The last two, Ethos and Kairos at the top right, we put them up there because, well, Ethos, all of us do and don't use it at the same time. We are using it because obviously we're using Villavencio's book. However, we also don't have it specifically in any of our arguments. As for Kairos,
Kairos, none of our arguments really had a lot of applications of time, or not in any specific noticeable way. So there's just not a lot to be found within that mode of persuasion.
Yep. Alright, for stasis theory. So each of our arguments, we had two of them that both broke down at values, and we had one that broke down at actions. So mine and Raymond's broke down at actions, while mine and Ryan's, and then Ryan's and Raymond's broke down at values.
So in regards to facts, we've all pointed out that there is an issue in what's going on, or that there's an argument that needs to be had regarding the state of undocumented people in the country.
As for definitions, we pretty much all agree on most of the definitions. For example, we have policy and prejudice. Both of these definitions we really agree on. We understand what they mean, and there's no real argument there.
I want to note that our Ryan and I's argument, when it comes to stasis theory, it ends at values, basically, just because my argument specifically talks about the policies, the immigration policies, while Ryan's is more concerned about the government generally.
Government policy in general, especially here with like the House of Reps voting on this piece of legislation, it wasn't specifically targeted to get undocumented peoples off of like Medicare. However, it ended up doing so, and there's even the stuff with Flint that also wasn't purposefully targeted at undocumented people. However, because they couldn't get the water from the government, there were places that needed state IDs, which they then didn't have. So even if it wasn't specifically like immigration policy, it still all came down to government policy being the causation of a lot of these issues.
As for mine and Raymond's, or actually no, we'll start with mine and Ryan's because
Sure.
it's still values. As for my argument and Ryan's argument, ours broke down at values, and this is mostly for the same reason that theirs broke up at values. Mine argues more for it is because of prejudice and because of America as a whole, not necessarily specifically the government, though the government does have a little bit to do with my argument. It wasn't specifically the government that causes my whole argument. Whereas Ryan's is very focused on the government is what causes all this, so he values the government. In his argument, I am valuing the America as a whole.
So our argument does end up ending at actions just because my argument specifically targets the concern about immigration policies, while Garrett's talks about the living conditions of just the undocumented Americans.
So, finally, for how effective we think the arguments are, I think mine is fairly effective because it makes sense and there's a lot of evidence for it. And then within the story, it will mention, like, specifically with the piece of legislation, actions of like the governor of Michigan, all that kind of stuff of the direct impact. So I think the argument does end up being effective there, and it makes sense and it's easy to follow.
So I completely agree with Ryan. I'd say his argument is probably the most effective, just because it uses so much logos. And for me personally, I look at logos and I think that if something has a lot of logos, that it is a very effective argument. As for my argument, I use pathos for most of it, which is okay. It's probably one of the best ways to get across to the reader and feel personable to the reader. However, I don't think it makes as good of an argument because you aren't stating facts necessarily, you're just getting out their emotion, and I prefer facts over emotion.
Yeah, so I agree with what Garrett said about how Ryan's argument is probably the most effective, but I also think that my argument is pretty effective just because while it also uses the logic factor when we talk about like the Einstein number and how it just doesn't correlate, it does also pull emotions just like Garrett's when we use pathos. So I think that having both of those to incorporate into the argument makes it somewhat effective.
Yeah, cool. I think that's it. Anything else?
I think that should be all.
All right, this is gonna be fun to edit down.
I think